Welcome back, everyone. In this video, I want to do something a little bit different, and I want to talk about a photographer who had a very profound influence on me and many others. A British photographer by the name of John Blakemore, who I believe, in all sincerity, was probably one of England's best-kept secrets in terms of photographers. John was absolutely amazing, and for years I didn't know who he was, and in about 2005, I found this book at a bookstore, which is called John Blakemore's Black and White Photography Workshop. At the time, I was shooting primarily black and white film, and I was doing a lot of darkroom printing, and so I was always on the hunt when I go to the bookstore to find stuff that would help me sharpen my skills. And this, of course, is back in the days where we had bookstores, and they used to carry cool stuff like this. It'd be very difficult to find now. In fact, this book is long out of print. But I bought this, got it home, and the first night read it cover to cover, and I probably read this about 6 times. It absolutely blew my mind. I bought this for the technical aspects, but John is way deeper than that, and he talks about the whole idea of the still life. He talks about composition, relevance of the image, treatment of the subject. It really is, for me, almost the Bible for black and white photography, and I've mentioned that on the show many times over the last 15 years. This book is long out of print. It's very difficult to find, but highly recommended if you happen to run across it. It is absolutely excellent. Now, the thing is, from a technical standpoint, and this is important understanding John Blakemore, for me, this is what drew me in. We're all familiar with Ansel Adams and the work he did with Fred Archer on the zone system, which is a prescribed method of producing a negative that will print on standard black and white paper. And so for the darkroom days, this was really important because it gave parameters and actually a technical method of how to get a print in the end. John took this in a different direction. And rather than just having this way to do things, he took the zone system and actually took this with an approach where you could totally have creative freedom with it. So why does zone 6 or zone 7 have to be sort of your last point of detail before it goes bright? Or why do the low zones have to be where they are? So could you put a shadow on zone 6 or 7 and have this high key image? Or could you do something in very low key? And there's several prints in here. He did this whole series on Tulips, which was his magnum opus of still lifes. And he would take one negative and do 3 different prints, and they'd look like 3 completely different photographs. One would be very dark, very moody. The other one would be what you would expect, a normal print, so to speak. And the other one would be very high key, and it would look more like maybe a pencil drawing or something like that. Anyway, John was absolutely brilliant at that kind of thing. And like I said, he goes way beyond that in this book. Well, years go by, and I always looked up to John, and I always remembered what he taught me as a photographer. And I'd never met him. He always seemed kind of half a world away, being in England. Last year, this changed a little bit. I met a guy named Richard Hall, and Richard sent me a couple books that I featured on Mailtime videos. Richard is an excellent photographer on his own. He does a lot of stuff that's influenced by theater. He works with an actress, and he does kind of these narrative books that sometimes the whole book will have some kind of context to it. Anyway, he's really good. We started talking after he sent me those books, and he made it clear he knew John Blakemore, and he had gone over and shared one of my videos with John. John really liked what I did. Well, at this point, you could have knocked me over with a feather, and he sent me an image of John watching one of my videos, which was really cool. And it was one of those moments where in the 15 years that I've done this YouTube channel, I look back and it's just like, wow, I never expected that. I thought it was really neat. I also want to mention that John asked Richard to send me 2 prints, and they're being framed right now, and I'll show them to you anyway. They're amazing. And again, this is just something that's a really interesting moment for me. But I wanted to share more about John on the channel. And last year we talked about it, and I thought really what would be cool is if I was able to go to England and we could sit down and have a conversation and talk about photography. And unfortunately, last year John was not in the best of health, and I didn't mention that on the channel at all. They were keeping that kind of private, which was fair. And in January he ended up passing, which was very unfortunate. But I thought it would be cool, since Richard Hall knew him very well, to sit down and do a Zoom call with Richard and have him talk about John Blakemore and some of the depth. There's things that I didn't really understand or know about John in here. He did this whole series of handmade books with color prints in them. He would just make things all the time. He was one of the most creative photographers that I think that I've ever been aware of. And nothing was off limits. Large format, 35 mil. He kind of did it all. And anyway, Richard did a little presentation, and so I'm going to roll that now. This is my Zoom call with Richard Hall about John Blakemore. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today. We, for those who don't know, we had a conversation the other week, and Richard knew John Blakemore pretty well. And I thought it'd be really fun to have him come on here and share some stuff with us. So, Richard, nice to see you. And
nice to see you.
Yeah, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk about John. I met John in 2019, so I've known him quite well over the last few years.
Mhm.
But I've done quite a bit of research and spoken to quite a lot of people in order to um, be able to give you some hopefully good information.
Do you want to talk about just how you met John? How you, because I thought that was an interesting story. How you guys kind of came to know one another.
Yeah, so I was come up to retirement in 2018 and bought a camera in 2017. Um, I was looking for something to do when I retired, and I joined the Royal Photographic Society, and I heard about a workshop that was being run at the Photopolar in Nottingham, which is about 20 miles away. And there was a photographer called John Blakemore. I'd never heard of John Blakemore, but I'd gone to university by that time. As soon as I retired, I went to university, and I mentioned John Blakemore to one of my tutors, and he was in awe of John Blakemore, the master printer. So I took the opportunity to go to a workshop, and it was a black and white printing workshop, which was quite funny, really, because I was a digital photographer, but it was more of an opportunity to spend some time with it. And I have to say, it was 2 days that I'll never forget, really. And as a result, I'll talk about it a bit more later, but
Sure.
as a result of that, I bought a print from John's website, from his what he called his bargain box, which are a set small prints, exactly the same as the bigger prints, but just small size and a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
And John wrote a note, and the note was so intriguing that I wrote back to John, and he invited me to come and see him at home in Derby, which is 2 hours away. And that started a friendship, really. I started going monthly and then fortnightly, and the last couple of years we've been in touch almost every week, just talking about photography and spending time together, really.
Cool. Well, let's see what you got here. I'm excited to share this with everybody. For those who don't know, he went over this with me. Richard did last week, or a couple of weeks ago when we talked, and he's got some really good stuff here. So I'm excited to see it.
Yeah. So John was born in 1933, just before between the wars, and in England, in Britain, just after the war, all young men had to do national service, and John went with a RAF to Tripoli, Libya, to do his national service for 2 years. He'd always been a pacifist, so he went as a nurse to Tripoli, and he managed to see a copy of Life magazine, and there was an article about the family of man. And he got his mum to send him a copy of the family of man, and he was so engaged with it that he decided he was going to become a photographer. He didn't know anything about photography, didn't know any photographers, but he decided that he was going to be a photographer. So he sent for a camera from Aden. It might be something that you know about, Ted. He bought a Kodak Retina 3C.
Classic camera,
yeah. Which, by all accounts, was a really good camera, built like a tank, German-made. It was launched in 1954, and I think John bought it in 1955, and I think they were quite expensive at the time.
Probably,
so
yeah.
I think he spent a fair chunk of his money on it, and immediately started making images in North Africa. And he didn't know it at the time, but he started making series of images. He didn't know why, but it became his method of working. And one of the series that he made was, he called it Siesta, and it was just people sleeping, because it's a hot country, and John just was drawn to making a series of images and examining as subject. Anyway, he came back to England, and found himself in Coventry, which is where he'd been born. And he decided that he was going to become a full-time professional photographer. And obviously there's no internet, and he'd got no connection with photography. So he got himself a bit of a portfolio together and went down to London and went around the different agencies, the picture agencies, and came across one called Black Star, which was quite a big international agency. And apparently the man looked at his portfolio of images from Africa and said, "You can't print, but you've got a good eye. You can be our stringer in the Midlands." and John went home, never expecting to hear again, but he got his first commission the next day, which was a car dispute in Coventry. But he didn't last very long as a stringer, because basically he went to jobs, made the images, sent the images to Black Star, and then never heard anything until he got a check. And he found it quite unfulfilling. So he managed to get himself as a manager of a portrait studio in Hillfields in Coventry. He could never explain how he got the job because he got no experience, no training. But he managed this portrait studio for about 4 years. And he had a disastrous start. There were a lot of Indian clients, and there was no history of chiaroscuro in Indian art. So John was producing these beautifully sculptured portraits with shadows and light, and his clients were just paying for the prints and then just ripping them up in front of him. And it took him a while to find out why they were so unpopular. But John's studio became quite a social hub. John was quite a shy man, really. You know, he was never the centre of attention. He was always the centre of attention because people wanted him to be, but personality-wise, he wasn't the centre of attention. But the studio became quite a social hub. John actually ran the Humanist Society of Coventry from the studio. So whilst John was working in the portrait studio, he was making personal work in Hillfields in Coventry, and he was looking at the transition of Coventry society. And he actually signed up for a City and Guilds course in photography at Coventry College. And as a result of that, he made a body of work, 90 images for the course, that he ended up by exhibiting at an architect's office in Coventry. And the way that he exhibited it, he decided that people weren't going to come into this building to see the prints. And it was all glass lined. So John put the prints inside the glass facing out so that people passing by would see the images. And they're just a really interesting set of images of society at Coventry at that time. And surprisingly, Coventry was quite multiracial at that time. You wouldn't have expected it to be, but John obviously had the trust of people, because you can see he's inside schools, he's inside shops taking portraits of people, and he even went into the local mosque and was making images in the mosque, which is something that you probably find difficult to do now, actually.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this work, as I say, this work was exhibited in Coventry. Alongside this work was all being made 35mm at this time. He was also making colour transparencies, and this work isn't well known. He gave me about 1,000 slides to scan about 3 or 4 months ago.
Wow.
And I've just been fascinated by this work.
Beautiful.
So alongside the black and white, which is obviously accepted, it's acceptable to make black and white documentary work, John was making these, quite intimate images of people in the parks, Hillfield, Coventry, where he lived. The image on the left, it reminds me, there's quite a famous painting, French painting down by the river.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that.
It's wonderful, yeah. The color on those is stunning. What did you say these were Kodachrome probably, or Ektachrome?
So these are Kodachrome and Ektachrome.
Both,
and
yeah.
all I've done, I've scanned them on a Epson V850, and I've not touched them.
Yeah.
These are just as they were. The exposures and everything's perfect, and they're in perfect condition. These slides have now been passed to James Hyman collection, and he's now got the slides.
Oh, that's cool. And these are 60 years old. I mean, that's
yeah,
amazing.
Yeah. And as I say, I've got about 1,000.
Wow.
But just these are all made sort of 1964, 1965. But alongside that work, again, John was also making quite interesting, intimate images of the landscape. And a lot of these images were made as he was walking along the canal, and they were made in series again.
Mhm.
And John was just photographing the light, really, and how the light interacted with the environment. Really delicate, beautiful images. And again, I've not touched these. Some of them he was using tungsten film outside.
Shooting outside to get the color shift. Yeah.
Get the color shift.
Amazing. Yeah, I love the when you showed these to me the first time, I can't quit thinking about them because I mean I've never seen these and most people haven't. And I love the journalistic approach that John seemed to have about having a camera, taking it and just capturing what was visually interesting to him.
Yeah.
Beautiful work.
And of course, in the days of film, you couldn't see what you got when you made it.
No.
You know,
But at the same time, I mean, all these color things that you're showing to me, and that's early slide film. I mean, your exposure, yeah, if you were overexposed or underexposed, I mean, it was real obvious. There wasn't a lot of play in that. And I mean, when you consider John's eye as a printer later on, I'm not surprised. I mean, you would expect nothing less from Perfect. He was just such a knack for that and so good at it.
So this is quite important. John met someone called Richard Sadler, who later became his mentor, his best friend and his mentor.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard Sadler worked at the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry. But John made a body of work, and I think this is why we got initially hit off, because he made a body of work called, in Coventry Cathedral of West Side Story, a production of West Side Story. And he photographed the whole process. He started at the read-through, he went to every rehearsal, and he photographed everything. And as I say, he made a series of prints for these. And what he told me subsequently was that he took these, he later went to London. He took these prints to London and he separated them into two piles. He couldn't keep them all because he got so many. And he made a pile that he liked and a pile that he didn't like. And at the end, he couldn't work out why he liked one pile and not the other. So they were all ripped up and all thrown away.
Wow. I love the one on the right with the motion blur on it. It's amazing.
Yeah. And this is a picture of Richard Sadler on the right, who was John's friend. And on the left is, you probably recognise Ouija.
Yeah, that's cool.
And for some reason, he came to Coventry. He was promoting Zenith cameras. And that's quite a famous photo of Ouija that was taken by Richard Sadler. And I think Ouija was so taken with the image that he gave Richard and John a 300mm Nikon lens.
Oh, wow.
And they shared it between them. John was interesting in that he never had much kit. He'd got a Nikon with two lenses. I think he'd got a 50mm and a 90mm, and then a half share and a 300. And when he started making his serious landscape work, he bought an MPP 5x4 camera. But he'd only got one lens. He only ever owned one lens. So he just made it work for everything.
I love that.
So I think John had a few personal problems in Coventry and ended up by moving to London for a little while. And he worked in two places in London. He got a job in a camera shop. And he worked in a studio. But while he was working in the camera shop in central London, he was at the front of the shop because he was more interested in the magazines than he was in the equipment. And he got into a conversation with Tony Ray Jones, who I'm sure you know. And they hit it off. And Jones had just come back from New York, where he'd studied under Brodovich. And John had got nowhere to live. So he ended up by moving into the flat with Tony Ray Jones and lived with him for about 6 months, I suppose. In between this time, John had a short spell in North Wales that became quite important to him, but he wasn't making images. And I think during this time, he did have quite a barren spell of not making any work. But he was subsequently invited to Derby University in 1970, where he started teaching with Richard Sadler, and he remained at Derby till 2001 when he retired. And he was made a professor in 1991.
Wow.
And the image that you see there is Glyndebourne by Tony Raine-Jones.
I love the cows, yeah.
So John stopped his documentary work. If you look at John's career, they seemed to be in blocks of 10. So he had 10 years as a documentary photographer and then 10 years as a landscape photographer. But he started working in the landscape in 1970. And I remember that he told me that he'd been on a trip to London in 1970 with some students for an exhibition. And on the way back, one of the students said that they'd got an exhibition and they asked John if he'd join the exhibition. And he was suffering a bit from creative block at that, and that sort of gave him the impetus to go and make some work. And he decided that he was going to make landscape work, and his desire was to be alone in the landscape, and he wanted to feel his insignificance, to experience the aloneness with intensity and to feel its awe. And John was interested in that he was never concerned with the wider landscape or the grandiose. He was always concerned with the photographic tracing of the ebb and flow of the process, of natural processes. So he was interested in tide and wind and rocks. And a lot of his work dealt with mortality, and a lot of his work reflected his mental state, what he was going through at that time. And he once showed me an image that he called precarious poise. And basically there was a stick on a rock. And he said he knew that if he went back that next day that stick wouldn't be on the rock. So he made the image, and that was typical John, really. The image that you can see there is called Metamorphosis, and that was made in North Wales. And at this time, a lot of John's prints were quite dark. So I'm going to read something, if that's okay. About
yeah,
this.
Please. Yeah.
This is from Wounds of Trees, which is another series that John made. And he said, this image is predominantly transformative. Subject and content diverge. The intention is metaphoric, and the reality of the tree is subverted to expressive ends. What was significant for me were the marks in the bark. I thought of these as hieroglyphs of chance, indicating a process of wounding that I came to see as a metaphor for human experience. I was collecting images of such markings as part of a series exploring ideas of the landscape as process. Looking at them in retrospect, I made a connection between my own precarious emotional state at the time and the marks redefined as wounds. The visual strategies respond to intention. The framing is tight, decontextualizing the fragment and giving no information about the space or the totality of the tree. The light was soft, producing little shadow. Exposure and development of the negative were chosen to give full detail with minimum contrast. The somber ambience of the final print and the play of light and dark are the product of print controls. The distribution of light and dark existing in the subject was reversed through the extensive use of local print controls that emphasize the wounds. The image is constructed in the darkroom and bears little resemblance to the actuality of the subject. And that is a typical John comment. John, incredibly deep and thoughtful.
Yeah.
A really intellectual person who thought really deeply about the subject. It wasn't just a picture.
No, it's an abstraction, but there's so much depth to it when you hear him talk about it like that. It brings it to a whole nother level. It's amazing.
Yeah. I've put this one on. I don't know why, really, because I found 3 nudes in the landscape. They seem completely out of kilter with John's work sometimes. But over the 10 years or so when he was making landscape images, he made a large number of bodies of work, and things like premonitions, emergence, sound of the sea, all flows, primal surge, spirit of place, Lila, wind series. It was all about energy. It was all about change. It was all about transformation.
Mm.
And I got really interested, and another student that I went to university with got really interested in a body of work called All Flows. And this is an image from All Flows, as is this image. And I find this really fascinating because John wanted to show the energy of water. He wanted to capture the energy of water. So he found a body of water that he thought he could work with. And he told me that the place was called Lynch Clough. And it's a stream that feeds into a reservoir in Derbyshire, about 30 miles from where John lived. And my fellow student wanted to make some work like John's. So we decided to go and visit Lynch Clough. And we were surprised that is Lynch Clough.
It looks nothing like what he photographed.
Nothing like what John was doing.
I love it.
But he spent 6 years in that stream.
Wow.
And he said he only actually explored about half a mile of it. And I asked him how often he went, and he said he went at least 3 times a week for 6 years.
Wow.
With his 5x4 cameras standing in this stream. And he said he'd always got a common way of working in the landscape. John would go and he would listen and he would be quiet and he'd think about what he was doing and he'd be there all day, whatever the weather, and he'd make no exposures, 1 exposure or 2 exposures. And then go away and think about what he'd done. But he said he visited time and time again to learn, to see, to allow the possibilities of communion of understanding. My photography of the landscape is built around this ritual intimacy. And All Flows is manifestation of energy expressed through event. So I don't know how many images there are in this series, but I've seen a dozen or so.
Wow, from 6 years of going back.
6 years, going 3 times a week.
It's amazing.
But that's how John made work, really.
Yeah.
And just a really thoughtful photographer.
Well, the reason this strikes me so much is that when you consider the way, especially photography today, where everybody's got the camera on their phone and it's very much democratizing the fact that everybody ends up having the opportunity to make photographs. But to do it the hard way like that, and I love the idea of expressing something that, when you're talking about transformative change, something that, how do you photograph that? A photograph is just a fraction of a second. And considering that into a body of work, or going back to the same place and sometimes just letting the landscape speak. And it's this intimacy with the subject that, obviously it pays off. The images are beautiful, but it's something only certain artists will do. It separates.
Well, this is what he did, and this is how he taught.
Yeah.
So at Derby, he'd got a mantra which was relationship, recognition, and realization. And relationship, he said, if you visit a place once, you end up by making the obvious images. But if you keep going back, same place, same thing, same motif, you gather intimacy with the subject. And recognition, he talked about, he did a workshop with Minor White in 1970. And he said that Minor White said the only choice the photographer has is to say yes to an aspect of the world that you wish to translate into image. And then the realization part of it is the play of the process. So for monochrome, it was the silver print, but for color, it was the activity of seeing and picture making. And it's just that was what he taught, really.
Beautiful.
And I was speaking to a friend on Monday of John's on Monday, Dan, and he was saying, John hated the word inspiration. He hated the word inspiration. He said, just play and see what happens. Stop waiting for inspiration to strike. Just go out there and play and just see what happens. And if you keep going, you'll find something. So in 1976, John had I've got a list of exhibitions. There must be 100. You know, he did exhibitions all over the world. But an exhibition at the Arnold Feeney Gallery in Bristol called Stand Before the World was a landscape exhibition. And it was a series of dark prints. And it was sold, the tagline was, it's a celebration of the landscape. But they'd sent a critic along called Jonathan Robertson, who became quite close to John in the end. But he didn't see it as a celebration. He saw it as a lament on the landscape. And I think that actually made John think. And I think that's where he started experimenting with different tonal values and making high key images. And I think that was, you know, that was a turning point, sort of 1976. But this body of work, and you've got one of these images, this body of work is called Lila. And I think there's 4 series of Lila. And there's 4 images in each series. But it looked at the elemental forces of nature, growth and renewal. I have one of these images, and I was given it at the workshop that I went to with the darkroom printing. There were only 4 of us on the workshop. And what John did, he used to get a negative and he'd make what he considered the print that he'd envisaged in the first place. He always used to pre-visualize what the print would look like before he made the negative. But having done that, he would then experiment and make darker and darker and lighter versions of it. And he was like an alchemist. It literally was like a magician. His hands used to dance. He was quite mischievous, and he'd got this piece of card that he used to dodge and burn with. And I thought it was a piece of leather because it was he'd been using this piece of card for like 30 years, just like a piece of leather, you know, little square piece of card. And he made 4 versions of this print and hung them up in the darkroom, and it was wet. And what John would normally do would be to take them off the hanging and just rip them in half and put them in the bin. And he did it at the university. So he'd show students a print, he'd make a print, and then he would just theatrically rip it up.
Sure.
And he quite enjoyed the process of doing that, and you know, talking to friends. One of his fellow lecturers, David Noble, who he was friends for many years, David said the look on the students' faces when he used to rip the prints up, horrified. I can't have that print. But John was got a thing about objects that, you know, they have to take the chance. But for some reason, he gave all 4 of us a copy of the print.
Wow.
Mine's on the wall behind me.
All different shades too.
Although he wouldn't sign it.
Oh, that's funny. Interesting.
So David Noble, who I mentioned there, David's quite an interesting character, and David helped me when I was doing my degree with my dissertation. David was interesting because David went to a workshop that John did in the 80s, I think, early 80s. David was working in London, went on a workshop with John and was so affected by him, he left his job, left London and went to Derby to study under John.
Wow, he was really inspired.
And then ended up by staying teaching at the university for 30 years afterwards.
Amazing. Life-changing. Yeah.
Yeah. And the Wind series and Lila, I get mixed up a bit, really, because they look
Similar,
quite similar. But John had this idea that wind could be photographed in the same way as water. And he was attracted to the fundamental paradox that the photograph describes the surface of a thing, but wind's invisible. So he wanted to photograph wind. And he thought, I'll photograph water. I can show water flowing. I can show the energy. So he set up his camera, his 5x4, to take an image of the wind. He went out on a windy day, made the exposure, which was a minute. And as he pressed the shutter, the wind died. So, typical John, he left it and thought about it for 6 months.
Yeah, right.
And he thought, the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to use multiple exposures. So I'll split my exposure up. I'll take my second exposure, but I'll split it up into multiple exposures. And I think he had to pre-flash the film to wake it up. But this is where you talk, because you mentioned earlier about the photograph being an instant of time. But he said because the method of multiple exposures meant the relationship between the photograph and time was extended, and it became a process, a mapping of time. It was an equivalent of the landscape itself. And his final image for the Wind series was 48 exposures.
Whoa.
So how you do that on a 5x4 and end up with an image that works, I've no idea.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's a lot.
He said he thought 50 was excessive.
Well, if anyone would know how to do that, it would be John Blakemore. But my Lord, that's intense.
It is intense.
But I love the idea, though, the whole idea of how do you, I mean, painters have dealt with this in a very different way, but, how do you visually represent something on a two-dimensional image, like, things like rain, things like wind, and he went for it. I love it.
Yeah.
They're the hardest things to do. They're invisible, right? So you
Absolutely.
you have to go off of the effect and the transformation. Yeah.
And what he didn't, I mean, if you did it on a modern digital camera and you set up an intervalometer, you'd have exposure, stop, exposure, stop, exposure, stop.
Yeah.
John was actually stopping the exposure, a 48th of a second or whatever, and then he was waiting for the next moment of wind.
It was all manual.
So
yeah.
It was extended over time, really.
Yeah, all manual.
But eventually stopped working in the landscape in about 1990. Is that right? 1980, 1981, something like that. Because he said he couldn't justify a practice that represented the landscape as Edenic. And this was typical of John. John had a very rural upbringing. I think his family were in horses, and John was mad about horses, and he was really interested in birds, and he collected books about them. But he only went into the landscape to make the photographs. And when he stopped making photographs in the landscape, he stopped visiting the landscape because he wasn't making images there anymore.
Right.
He did return for a couple of projects after he'd finished working in the landscape, but they were commissions. He did a thing, the Year of the Tree, which was an arts council thing, and he did a project in Fulbeck, which is about 2 miles away from where I live, where I campaigned for the preservation of rural England. And this was typical John. John took the commission, got on site and found out that Fulbeck was going to be used as a nuclear dumping site, which was something that he obviously wasn't happy about. So he contacted his commissioners and said, "Can I photograph the protests? Can I photograph the signage and everything?" And they basically said, "No, you can't. We don't want to get involved in politics at all." So John said, "Where do I send the money back to then?"
Wow.
And they allowed him to make those images. It is strange. I mean, it's a 1.5 miles from where I live now.
Man of principle, though, yeah.
But if you listen to what John said later in life, he started making photographs at home in the interior, in his parlour at home, and in his garden, and he always considered those to be interior personal landscapes.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a definite relationship,
So moving on again, I am missing quite a lot of John's bodies of work because he was so prolific over his lifetime. We next move on to his still life work, really, and he starts with thistles, really. And I think he'd done some work in the garden. He put some thistles in a bag, and when he went back to them the following week, he found that they'd broken down, but they'd all gone silvery and beautiful. So he decided to make images of them, like dissections. And I tried making some still lifes about a year ago, and I asked John for some tips, and he said a still life is a bit like a jigsaw with no pattern.
Mm.
So he said, just take the pieces and see how they fit together, and just experiment and
Right.
think about the edges. And there's an American still life photographer called Jan Grover, who John knew, and I think he was quite a big admirer of Jan Grover's.
Mm.
So these photos here were taken by Dan Wheeler at the what was then the Photo Polo, now called Take It Easy Lab,
Mm-hmm.
in in Nottingham, and it's a black and white and colour lab that people can join and they can make their own work there, and it's a bit of a community hub, really.
Mm.
But John taught at the Photo Polo between 2014 and 2020, and he taught darkroom printing and handmade bookmaking. And the courses were always full, and everyone will tell you that it was the best experience, and people don't forget working with John. And I was lucky in that I did both the darkroom printing and the bookmaking course.
Oh, cool.
But he also taught earlier in his career at the photographer's place in Derbyshire with Paul Hill. And I was doing a bit of research on one of his workshops, and I found some writing that somebody had written about one of his workshops in 2011.
Mm.
And this guy didn't know Blakemore.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes him as, this is Tim Parkin in 2011. He said, John comes across as a bit of a Pan-like figure, full of wonder with the world and very passionate about his work, but with a chaotic streak running through things, a momentary irreverence that I found most appealing. And he said, John's teaching style was relaxed. We sat around a table instead of being lectured. And he passed around example prints. And these prints were something beyond anything I'd ever seen. He said, I went to Ansel Adams' exhibition recently, expecting to see some good printing displayed. And despite them being very good, I wasn't blown away. And he said, I saw some of Faye Godwin's exhibition, and these were very nice too. But he said, John Blakemore's black and white prints take things to a different level completely. He said, I didn't want to let some of them go as they were passed around. He had such amazing control of high and low key areas, and few prints were handed out, worked in the very top or bottom couple of zones. In other cases, the combination of print and paper added quality, adding up to something almost visceral. And he goes on. He said, the prints blew me away. But he said, John's way of working is to use each photograph as a step towards a different way of thinking. He described each photograph as a base camp in a journey of discovery, or as John puts it, an individual photograph becomes not an end in itself, but a link in a chain of expanding visual possibilities. And again, this is what John said. If you made a decent negative, you could do anything with it. And that was something that he was really, really skilled at. And he wasn't afraid of playing. And as I said to you before, John was never precious about the early prints from negatives, because he said that every time he printed it, he learned something new about the negative.
Mm-hmm.
So he always said that his later prints were better than the early ones. But this is just typical John. John would just sit and just talk. And I found John a bit intimidating when I first met him, not because he is intimidating, but because he's just so thoughtful and so considered. So it makes you nervous about what you're going to say, whether you're...
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
He never felt like that. And in all my conversations with John, I used to go and take my work, and I'm just a regular photographer. Mm-hmm. But John was as interested in talking about my work as he was. He didn't want to talk about his work all the time. He wants to talk about my work. And he wasn't precious about digital either. The only thing that he'd said about digital is it allowed you to discard work without considering it properly. But
I would agree.
He's just such a generous person. There's a couple more photos from the photo parlor that Dan sent me over. So this is the first print that I bought. It was a very small print, and I think I paid £60 for it.
Wow.
And it came, and with the print was a card, and John always used to write a card when anybody bought print off him. One time, John did sell in big galleries, but he was never keen on the work being sold for lots of money. He always wanted to sell work that people could afford, and he accepted that not everybody could afford it, but he didn't want to think like he was ripping people off. So this is what it says on the back of my card. Thank you for your interest in my work and for your purchase. The early tulip work was an exploration of the space of my kitchen, of the interaction of frame and viewpoint, subject, all that the frame contains, a movement from simplicity to complexity, and always light. I hope the print gives you pleasure. And that's when I contacted him, really.
Oh, that was, yeah.
He seemed so approachable in the card. I thought,
sure,
I wonder if he'll help. So what he was talking about is, so his tulip work became is really his signature work. But it started by accident. He decided to do a postgraduate degree in about 94, something like that. And John loved writing and he loved literature and he wrote very well, but he found it really difficult. And he was doing a postdoc in film studies, master's degree in film studies, and he was trying to write. And he said the tyranny of the paper. He kept writing, screwing it up, writing, screwing it up. But he was always also looking for a way to further his photography. So he picked up his camera and just started photographing the space around him. And it just so happens that there was a vase of tulips on the table. And there's nothing, I believe that story totally, because, John was always surrounded by flowers and always surrounded by light, prisms, and it was just fascinating for him. And he just started to photograph the space. As it happens, in the end, the tulips became the dominant motif for his work, but it was never about the tulips. He did say if it had been daffodils, the work wouldn't have lasted very long at all, because daffodils live to attention and they die in the same position really quickly.
Right.
Whereas tulips are ever changing, and you can photograph them in so many ways, and there's so many different varieties. So what John writes is that gradually the tulip emerged as the dominant motif, an object of continuing fascination, text and pretext for an activity of picture making. He says the tulip is a flower of sensual and gestural elegance, of constant transformation, worthy of contemplation, of a prolonged and intense scrutiny. The sustained working and reworking of a theme, a motif, facilitates an accumulation of reference through which the tulip can function both of an object of celebration and as a metaphor. And John made images of tulips, or the black and white tulips, 15 or 20 years. And he was constantly reinventing the way that he photographed them. This is one of my favourites. This is Garden of Earthly Delights. And it's just simply tulips, tulip petals that he's ripped off. And he used to have a baseboard in his sitting room on his table, and it was angled slightly up, and he used window light. He never ever used artificial light, which meant that often the prints were unevenly lit, which made them difficult to print. But I've seen this print. I've got a dark version of this print, but I've seen this print printed in very many different ways. And then this is an example.
Yes, there you go, of the three different interpretations of the same
negative.
Yeah, I love that.
And each of those photographs is successful. You would have any of. Whereas if you did that with a portrait, it just wouldn't work, would it? It wouldn't work.
No, that works. And they're three different but yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're three different pictures, but they're the same picture.
Yeah,
By the time he did the book, John Blakemore's Black and White Photography Workshop, tulips dominate that, and there's a lot of great
yeah,
examples of this in here.
yeah.
That was what was the big Zen slap for me with John, was that this whole idea of, like, Ansel talks about interpreting a print, but that's showing you like what you can really do with different interpretations, and that was so eye-opening for me.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
And the tulip is such a wonderful subject for that too. It's a common object most people understand, but like
yeah.
that image, for instance, Garden of Earthly Lights, when you the tones he's able to pull out of that, and oh, it's amazing. It's beautiful. You don't even really see that as tulips at first. It's this abstract, organic thing, you know.
Well, it's quite interesting because John lived in a provincial city in Derby, which, is just a normal small city in England, sort of
Hmm.
2 hours north of London.
Hmm.
And I asked John where he got his tulips from, and he got them from a market stall in London, St Martin in the Fields. So a little woman used to send him a brown parcel of tulips every
Wow.
week on the train. She used to put them on the train, and John used to pick them off at the other end.
Huh.
And this is like the 1990s. And I asked John, I said, how much money were you spending on tulips, John? He said, £2,000 a year.
Oh, wow.
It was an absolute fortune.
Well, when you only own one camera lens, I guess. See, there's the moral of that story. Spend money on tulips.
But he made a book called The Stilled Gaze, and he was looking for final images for the stilled gaze.
Mm.
Um, and he decided to photograph his studio table.
Mm.
So at the start of the season, the studio table would look very different to the end of at the end of the season, and he would photograph it through the season. And he wanted to include all the ephemera that he used, the bits of tape and the scissors. And I've got one of the studio series. And,
that's cool.
And they're just gorgeous.
This is another one of my favorites, because that's something for, I mean, any artist to easily overlook, because it's right under your nose, but it's so amazing. Those are some of my favorites. And the way he'd have all those on the wall, I mean, they're everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they're on the floor, under the table. I mean, it's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. John really went for something when he went for it.
Oh, all the way.
And John exhibited work, internationally, as I said, a lot, but he transitioned away from, he sort of transitioned away from still life and started making handmade books in 1985.
Mm.
And he did make some black and white handmade books, which were more traditional. I haven't had the pleasure of seeing those. They are held at the Central Library of Birmingham, who've got an archive of about 2,000 items of John's.
Oh, wow. That's a lot.
They're having some money problems at the moment, so it's difficult to access. I was hoping to get some screenshots, but there are some black and white books that deal with the zone system that you'd be quite interested in looking at.
That's amazing.
But he started to make handmade books in 1985, and he went back to his colour work of the 1960s that we saw earlier, and he was making photographs on his Nikkormat 35mm camera. And he was taking the workflow was very different in that he was taking the films just to a local lab, a local high street lab that everybody else took their holiday photos to.
Mm.
And he saw that the picture maker was very different in that he thought that the initial seeing for the image was important, and then the sequencing was important, but the actual process, he gave that away. Sometimes he cut the imprints up, but he wanted them to have a home, so he put them into handmade books. And not all of these books were made in his front room and in his garden, but most of them were. I don't know how many books he made. I know that the Centre for British Photography, the James Hyman, has got over 30. I'm really lucky in that I've got 3. This one here, Reflections Rose, John used to use this in workshops to demonstrate sequencing and how sequencing worked. I'll play that while we're talking.
Yeah.
And just these are just really simple handmade books, and it started off with the reflection roses, and then it's difficult to work out sometimes if you're looking at a reflection or you're actually looking at the object.
Right.
But this is just a typical John book of imprints, but just really delicate, really beautiful. Sometimes you can see an image of John in the background, and just typical of John, really.
Cool. So he made a lot of these.
Well, I know about 40, and there must be lots that I don't know about.
Considering how much work he put out, that's quite a bit, you know.
Yeah, he gave me this one in December. This is a more complicated book. This again is a concertina book, again just made with hand prints, and he's got some nice paper, and this one's called Reflections. And again, it's difficult you never see the space in full. And John always writes little pieces in the books, either from Bart's or a piece of poetry, or something that he's written himself. And you can just see the process of John just making images, really, always using natural light. So he had to go with the ebb and flow of the seasons because he'd only got a small window, east facing. And he just made images and just paired them and sequenced them beautifully. Just really delicate images. This was made when he was 70, I think.
Wow. Amazing, though.
Yeah, really beautiful.
I love that he's in a lot of those reflections, too. It makes it feel more like a sketchbook, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, John, these handmade books, they're not, I mean, you see some fabulous artistry with handmade books, but John just had a Pritt stick and some glue and a ruler.
Just making a book, yeah.
And just made a book, and he'd spend 2 hours making the book. He'd think a lot about the process of how he sequenced it. And I've got some little small prints here. And this is from a book called End of Roll. And this is typical John in that he'd got a kitchen table and he used to lay prints out because students would come. He'd always have students at home. He'd always have photographers at home, people visiting. And he'd get a cup of tea and some biscuits, and he'd get his roll of paper and he'd just roll his paper out on the table and put prints on it. And that's how John conversed and talked to people. But he saw that this roll of paper was a beautiful thing in itself.
I love this.
So he just made a book called End of Roll. And it's just, you know, I unfortunately haven't got that book, but I do have the prints, and just, you know, he just made the ordinary extraordinary, John did.
Well, there's always a concept or an idea that's being expressed. And I think that's an important takeaway. A lot of photographers, as you know, I get a lot of books, and there's so many that, you know, I think especially when somebody's going to spend money on getting a book printed, they want to do a retrospective greatest hits of things, and that's what they're pairing together. And I totally understand that. I've even done it. But going for a concept or an idea and just having the book be one statement, I love that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
Absolutely. Well, without a concept, there's no reason to turn the page, is there?
No, there isn't.
There's just no reason to turn the page.
Yeah.
And then last year, James Hyman, Centre for British Photography, got a lot of John's archive. He's got a lot of prints, and you know, his website's fantastic, and you've got access to them. But John made a short video, a 20-minute video of John talking.
Oh, cool!
Which is really, really worth watching, and I'll send you the link if you like.
Please do. And I was going to say, I mean, you know, and for people watching this, one of the things that makes it difficult with John is there's not a whole lot that exists that's out there. There is a lecture in front of an audience or an interview that was done. There's a couple things, but and they're all good. But and unfortunately, after his passing, I mean, a lot of his work it's being archived. Correct? It's going to certain places. Yeah. So the preservation and the good.
Yeah. I mean, he's got an archive at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. He's got an archive
Good.
at the Centre for British Photography. He's got the Martin Powell Foundation's got his documentary work. Yes, they're definitely archived, and he has got stuff in museums all over the world.
Sure.
But John was really humble and wasn't pushy.
I like that they've gone to a lot of major British institutions too. I mean, he really is,
And it's a really nice video that James Hyman did. I know John was never happy with it. He thought that he babbled, and he didn't babble at all.
No, but everybody thinks that of themselves. I made many videos, and I babble a lot.
This is the typical John at the end of the recording. He said, at the end of the day, there's lots of bits of paper in boxes. And you can just see that mischievous smile on his face. And then I've just got to acknowledge, Hyman Collection and Martin Parr were really kind in allowing me to use the images for this.
Yes, big thank you to them. That's well, and this was an important video to make. I mean, you and I connected. I'm trying to remember. You sent the books in, and I can't remember when you sent them, but I mean, it was last year, I believe.
Yeah.
And I was very taken by your work, and you didn't approach me with name dropping with Blakemore at all. That came later, I think, when we started discussing, and you had shown my videos to John, which just blew me away. I mean, John, he's, I think, one of the, well, I think in today's day and age, there are a lot of underrated photographers. He would probably be at the top of my list. He was so good. And, having you go through this and talk about it, I'm realizing too, the humility that he had. The whole thing with wanting to make his prints affordable and approachable and make art available to people. I mean, that's probably one thing that makes him, it's very impressive in my mind. It probably didn't help his career much, but those kinds of things. But he is somebody who's very much overlooked. And it was very important, when you and I started talking and you had such a deep connection with him, for me to get you on here to share some of that. John was the man. I mean, I guess you're fairly impressionable when you're starting out on a journey. And I think when I started to print, I found a copy of John's book. I didn't necessarily know who he was at that time. And then I got into it and got very interested in his work and who he was. And that book changed my life to a degree where I don't ever do, even with digital post-editing, that's how I think of the zone system. I always think of John. And he had that profound an impact on me. And that name is just ingrained. I mean, and it's so really interesting for me to be able to see, especially a lot of that early work that's in color. I didn't know that existed. Handmade Books. He went deeper than you think. It's beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful.
As you say, I mean, he never advertised his kindness. I once heard about a student, a young student who absolutely admired and loved his work. Mm-hmm. And he overheard her saying that she'd love something, but she couldn't afford it. Mm. And he asked for her portfolio. And when she got home and opened it, he put a print in.
That's so cool.
It's just
surprise.
Yeah. I mean, he's been so kind to me with his time. He doesn't judge, but if something's not good, I've made a few projects, and I showed him a project, and it just didn't work, and John said it didn't work.
He'd just tell you,
just tell you.
Well, that I think some of the things that you're talking about are traits of what makes great teachers great as well. And not every great photographer is a great teacher. I mean, you can extend this beyond photography. But I think it's the ability it's the concern of the student, the ability to really take their work seriously, tell them when something is not working, or even surprising somebody with a print in their portfolio, which it's a really sweet thing. And it's a rare trait. John would have still been great had he not been a great teacher. You and I might not having this conversation, but I love that he had that too, Yeah. It's a very rare thing for any individual.
Yeah.
But, and I am sorry. I know you were friends, and I am very sorry on that end to hear about his passing too. one of the greats, but a long life and well spent. The whole idea of this is still in my mind, like, the talking about the little creek that none of the pictures looks like when you actually go there. And he went there for 6 years to listen and to reevaluate. And there are so few photographers that are willing to take that kind of patience. It's hard for me.
Yeah. But I will say, Ted, I'm a bit of an imposter. There's people who've known John for 60 years who know far more than me. But I was fortunate to spend, the last 5 or 6 years in his company.
Well, that's nice of you to say, but Richard, I don't know them. I know you. That's well, and I'm going to put this back around too, because your two projects, I get a lot of work in that I share, obviously, and I really thought your work was unique. It's different. You're not a John Blakemore Part 2 at all, and I'll link up that video for those that are interested in seeing Richard's work. Richard works a lot with the element of theater, which obviously, that West Side Story project would be very appealing. And it's something that I just don't see a lot of people embracing in the way that you do it. And I can tell that probably those Handmade Books it was the one that was your thesis, I believe, which was the one with the notes and stuff that were stuffed into various spreads. I love it. Those were two incredible books. And it was just really kind of a icing on the cake that we ended up having this conversation and you knew Blakemore. And at the time, John was still alive, and that you had shared his videos with me, and you sent me that picture of John watching me, and it was just like, oh wow, this is. I never thought that, my gosh, but you can tell. John was somebody who just loved photography, Otherwise, he wouldn't listen to me. I'll tell you that.
No.
But thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this, and thanks to the folks that gave you permission to use the images that you guys are seeing in here. And this is something. I don't know if I think we may have talked about it, but my original idea was I thought it would be really cool to do something with John one day, and obviously we didn't get on that fast enough. Within a couple months, and you told me he was not particularly well at the time, and
it wasn't.
Yeah. So anyway. Well, cool. Well, Richard, thank you so much for coming on. This has been absolutely wonderful.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Richard, for coming on and making this happen. And like I mentioned, John just had this enormous influence on me, even though we never met, that is hard for me to describe sometimes. But he's one of those photographers that everything that I do in photography, even though I'm working digitally today, I'm always thinking about John's approach. I think the methods, even though John was working in a darkroom, they're still universal when we get into the modern age. And if you guys are interested, I'll put some links to John's stuff below. There's a really good video interview that somebody did. And anyway, if you have any questions or comments, leave them, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.